Psalm 20. The battle belongs to the Lord. Now let's read this song. The Lord hear thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob defend thee. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. Remember all thy offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice. Selah. Now remember, Selah is a word that is calling for a pause. This is a musical hymn that we're covering here. All of the Psalms are hymns or songs. And they have this word Selah, which is either like a rest note or a pause, which allows those that are singing to contemplate on what they've just said or what they're getting ready to say. Remember all thy offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice. Selah. Give thee according to thine own heart and fulfill all thy counsel. We will rejoice in thy salvation. And in the name of our God we will set up our banners. The Lord fulfill all thy petitions. Now know I that the Lord saveth his anointed. He will bear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots, and some in horses. But we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They are brought down and fallen, but we are risen and stand upright. Save, Lord, let the King hear us when we call. Charles Spurgeon said of Psalm 20, we have before us a national anthem, fitted to be sung at the outbreak of war, when the monarch is girding on his sword for the fight. If David had not been vexed with wars, we might never have been favored with such a psalm as this. A happy people here plead for a beloved sovereign, and with loving hearts cry out to Jehovah, God save the King. I gather that this song was composed to be sung in public, not only from the content of the song, but from its dedication to the chief musician. And he was either the congregational leader of music, or he was director of the choir, or both. But it's clear that this hymn of prayer is prophetical of our Lord Jesus. The militant people of God, with the great captain of salvation at our head, may still in earnest plead that the pleasure of the Lord may prosper in his hand. Only the Lord can lead his people into victory. And this he grants when prayer is offered to him, expressing total reliance on him. Thus, believers must always look to the Lord when they are confronted with conflict. The battle belongs to the Lord. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 47. In this psalm, King David, the commanding general of Israel's military forces, was preparing to lead his armies into battle. To seek the Lord's favor, the people gathered in a holy convocation to pray for their leader. The people acknowledged their dependence on God, petitioning him for the victory. Such a public gathering involved prayer offered for David, their general king, and their expression of confidence in God in verses 6 through 8, and a reformation or a reaffirmation of their reliance on him in verse 9. Only 9 verses in this whole chapter. Psalm 21 follows Psalm 20. Psalm 21 is a celebration after the battle, as Israel rejoiced in the victory given by God. One thing they were sure, victory belonged to the Lord. So at first we have the petitioning or the petitions for the king in verses 1 through 5. Beginning in verse 1, the Lord hear thee in the day of trouble. The name of the God of Jacob defend thee. As David, Israel's king and commanding general, prepared to go into battle, the congregation of Israel, probably the national leaders, gathered to pray for him. Approaching God in prayer, they asked, the Lord hear thee in the day of trouble, meaning, may God hear your prayers for victory in the distress of battle. Throughout this prayer, you refers to the anointed King David. Likewise, may the name of the God of Israel defend thee was a request that the king's physical safety be preserved by divine providence and power. Now verse 2. Send thee help from the sanctuary and strengthen thee out of Zion. This aspect of their intercession acknowledged God's symbolic presence in the Ark of the Covenant that David had recaptured and installed in the tabernacle or the tent in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. The people prayed for God's power to uphold, support, and sustain the king by granting him powers of leadership, character, reasoning, and decision making as the battle progressed. Verse 3. Remember all thy offerings and accept thy burnt sacrifice, Selah. Likewise, they prayed, may God remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings. They requested that David's offerings would be acceptable to God, and an indication that his spiritual life was strong. If the king's leadership in battle was to be strong, his spiritual life must be strong. So the people prayed for the spiritual well-being of their commander. Verse 4. Grant thee according to thine own heart, and fulfill all thy counsel. Since David was a man after God's own heart, from 1 Samuel 13:14 and Acts chapter 13, verse 22, they assumed he would be seeking what God desired. In this sense, they asked God to grant the desires of his heart, knowing that David's ambitions were holy aspirations for God's kingdom. Verse 5. We will rejoice in thy salvation, and in the name of our God will we set up our banners, or battle flags. The Lord fulfill all thy petitions. Concluding this prayer, the assembly prayed, we will shout for joy when you are victorious. They anticipated shouting for joy over his triumph in battle, where they would lift up banners in the name of our God. And these banners were the troop standards, the battle banners, around which their units rallied in battle. Repeating their prayer, they interceded, may the Lord grant all your prayers. And not only do we have the petition for the king, but we have the prayer of the king, verses 6 through 8. Now know I that the Lord saveth his anointed. He will hear him from his holy heaven with the saving strength of his right hand. David acknowledged with inner assurance that their prayers on his behalf had surely been heard and would be answered. He said, now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. In other words, God would surely grant military victory to David, who had been anointed years before to rule in the Lord's divine name. Recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 4, 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, and again in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 3. The word anointed was used by David of Saul, and now of himself as king. 1 Samuel 24:6 and verse 10, 26:9, 11:16, 23, and 2 Samuel 1:14. Victory over foreign armies was assured because God answered David's prayer with the saving power of his right hand. This was an expression of divine omnipotence. Now let's go to verse 7 and 8. Some trust in chariots. I think this is the key verse in this whole psalm. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They are brought down and fallen, but we are risen and stand upright. On the behalf of the nation, David confessed his trust in God. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. That's who we'll trust in. David realized that ultimately the battle is not ours, but God's. Now, isn't it strange that people twist things? David didn't leave his armor at home. He didn't tell all of his people to get off the horses, the war horses. He didn't tell them to leave their shields and their helmets at home. No, they had those. But they could have had a battle tank or 1,000 of them, and it wouldn't have helped unless God was there to bring victory. God expects us to use means. I had one of my first cousins, Jimmy Smith. His mother was raised in a different denomination than the Smith family was. My grandfather, Fred Smith, was an old regular Baptist preacher. And she was brought up in a Church of God out of Indiana. Now, they didn't speak in tongues, but they did not speak in tongues, but they believed in doctors. They did not believe in doctors. And he had her dad. I was probably around 10 or 12 years old. And we were visiting her dad and my cousin Jimmy, and we were playing on the farm, you know. And we were about ready to leave, and my Aunt Blanche called me into the house. She said, "Terry," she said, "I want you to talk to Dad about going to the doctor. He's got a growth on his face here, and I want him to go to the hospital or go to the doctor and have that examined and see if he's got cancer. But he won't go." Said he don't believe in doctors. I don't know why she asked me. I was just 12 or 13 years old. You know, what have I got, business I got trying to talk an 80-year-old man into going to the doctor after he don't believe in doctors all these years, you know. So I went in and I said, "I understand you've not been feeling good." He said, "No." He said, "And you're losing weight." "Yeah." "And you got this growth here on your face, and you don't know what it is." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "You know, Timothy, in the Bible, you know who that was, don't you?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Paul told Timothy to take a little wine for his stomach's sake. Do you think he wanted Timothy to get drunk?" "Oh, no. He wouldn't have told him to do that." "Well, what were they using the wine for?" He said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, it doesn't make any difference whether we know or not. Paul's the one that told him." But I said, "You know, they use wine or alcohol as a catalyst for medicine. So it's preserved and nothing happens to it and it's still potent." And Did you realize that Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and wrote all of the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, did you know what his vocation was? He said, well, he was a doctor. Well, I said, if God could use Timothy and wine in the medicine he was supposed to take, and if he could use Luke, who was a doctor, to write the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, and the book of Acts, I suspect it'd be all right for you to go to the doctor, wouldn't it? And he thought about it. He said, well, maybe so. Well, he went to the doctor, found out it was cancer, had it burned off. He lived another 10, 12 years. So some people have this idea, they read this verse and said, well, you don't need chariots then. You don't need horses. You don't need any armor. But yet, we come over to the New Testament here, and Paul tells us to put on the helmet of salvation. All the battle implements of that time, Paul said we need to take the spiritual shield, and we need to take a spiritual sword when we go to fight the enemies of God. Just because God is going to bring victory doesn't mean that you're not to be equipped for war. Just because David said not to put your trust in the chariots and the horses, but to put your trust in the Lord, doesn't mean that he doesn't want you to take a sword to the battle. As far as we know, they took swords and implements to war to every battle that David brought against, when he fought against the Philistines and others. He was victorious. My goodness, who was it that cut off Goliath's head with his own sword? David. So we need to balance things out here. None of those things would be helpful if God wasn't in it. David realized that ultimately the battle is not ours but God's. And those who trusted in their weapons instead of God would be brought to their knees and fall in defeat. Psalms 33, verse 16 and 17 says, "There's no king saved by the multitude of a host. A mighty man is not delivered by much strength. And horse is a vain thing for safety, neither shall he deliver any of his great strength. But those who trusted in God would rise up against the enemy and stand firm in victory." And not only do we have the petition for the king and the prayer of the king, but the pleadings for the king. Verse 9, the last verse in this song. "Save, Lord, let the king hear us when we call." In a final reaffirmation, the congregation interceded for David, their king general, when they petitioned, "O Lord, save the king." One last time, they asked God to bestow military victory on David as he went into the battle. Napoleon Bonaparte, the famed military leader, was once asked, "Is God on the side of France?" Intoxicated with the power of his own success, he retorted, "God is on the side that has the heaviest artillery." And later, this diminutive dictator boasted, "I make the circumstance." But that was before the Battle of Waterloo. In 1815, Napoleon's army advanced across Europe into Belgium to face the armies of Britain and the Duke of Wellington, Charles Wellesley, where, in spite of his superior weaponry, and cannon, Napoleon lost both the battle and his empire. This humble dictator was unseated from his throne and exiled to the barren island of St. Helena. Napoleon changed his perspective about God and history. Quoting the words of Thomas Aquinas, this once proud man, Napoleon, finally acknowledged, man purposes, but God disposes. Napoleon's fall is a valuable lesson for everybody. God is sovereign, and he rules over the affairs of all people from the greatest to the least. And this is the lesson that all of us must learn. God controls human history and destinies, and he's guiding them to their appointed end. God's sovereignty must be the confidence of all believers when faced with the opposition of spiritual forces. God is God, and victory belongs to him. But before we leave this great battle song, we must remember David is the type of Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the antitype who will lead the charge on his great white horse at the Battle of Armageddon. And what a victory that will be. That's the message this evening. Next week we'll take up the victory song after the battle.